Nora Mae Calloway pressed both hands flat against the cast-iron stove and breathed through her teeth. 3 cracked ribs. She knew what broken felt like by now. She'd been cooking breakfast for 23 men on a Wyoming cattle ranch for 6 months, and not one of them knew her husband had come home 3 nights ago and introduced his fist to her side because the cornbread wasn't sweet enough. She turned to reach the bacon. The pain nearly dropped her to her knees. That was the exact moment Jessie Whitmore walked through the kitchen door. If this story moved, you hit that subscribe button right now and tap the bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me because what happens next inside this kitchen is going to change everything. The bacon was burning. Nora Mae knew it before she smelled it. She'd been standing at the stove for 3 full minutes without moving, which was 3 minutes longer than she could afford on a working morning at the Whitmore Ranch. But the pain had spiked the moment she reached for the skillet, a white-hot thing that started just below her left arm and spread through her whole rib cage, like a wire pulled too tight, and her body had simply refused to cooperate. She forced herself to move anyway. That was the thing about pain. You didn't negotiate with it. You just kept working. She grabbed the skillet handle, shifted the bacon, kept her breathing shallow and even. Behind her, the kitchen was dark. 5:15 in the morning, not even gray light yet through the single east-facing window. She had biscuits, rising potatoes on the second burner, coffee already done. 18 eggs waiting to be cracked. The ranch hands would start filtering in by 6. Jessie Whitmore himself was usually first, always had been, even before she'd started working here. She'd learned his rhythms the same way she'd learned everything in this kitchen, by watching, by staying quiet, by making herself useful enough that nobody paid her too much attention. Being invisible had kept her alive for 6 months. Boyd Langley had married her 2 years ago in Cheyenne. She'd been 24 and desperate in a way that looked a lot like hope from the outside. He had a smile that arrived before the rest of his face, and a voice like warm water, and she'd mistaken both of those things for kindness. She hadn't known the difference yet. She'd learned it on the 4th night of their marriage when she burned the coffee, and he taught her in his particular way what consequences meant. She'd been learning ever since. Boyd had drifted into the Whitmore territory 6 months back, found ranch work, and brought Nora Mae with him, the same way a man brings a piece of furniture he's not sure he still wants, but isn't ready to throw out. Mr. Whitmore had needed a cook. Nora Mae had needed something to do with her hands besides flinch. The arrangement had worked mostly, except for the ribs, for 3 nights ago, Boyd had come in from a long day in a foul mood, and a bottle of whiskey halfway gone, and dinner had been waiting on the table the way it always was, hot and ready, because Nora Mae had learned that cold food and late food were 2 of the things that shortened whatever patience Boyd had. The problem that night hadn't been the food. She still wasn't entirely sure what the problem had been. That was how it went with Boyd. The real mistake was usually just her existing in a way that inconvenienced him. He'd waited until they were inside the small foreman's cabin at the edge of the property. He always waited until they were inside, and then the same motion she'd learned to brace for, not a swing, never a full swing. Boyd was smarter than that, just a short, precise punch, angled just right, directly into her left side. She'd gone down against the wall. He'd finished his whiskey and gone to sleep. She'd been to work the next morning, and the morning after that, and this morning. The biscuits needed to come out. She moved to the oven, opened it, pulled the tray, felt the heat rush across her face, and the pain rush through her side simultaneously. She set the tray on the counter and stood very still for a moment, with both hands gripping the edge of the woodhead down, eyes closed, waiting for the wave to pass. It was in that position that Jessie Whitmore found her. She didn't hear him come in. He moved quiet for a man his size, 6'2", maybe 6'3", lean in the way of men who work from sunup to dark, with hands that had broken horses and mended fences and delivered calves in the middle of blizzards. He'd owned this ranch since his father left it to him 11 years back. 41 acres. 41 men during peak season, 23 now. Everyone who'd ever worked for him said the same thing: fair pay, hard work, no nonsense. Nora May had spoken maybe 15 words to him since she'd arrived. "Mrs. Langley?" His voice came from the doorway, and she straightened so fast the pain nearly blinded her. She let go of the counter, turned around, put something like a normal expression on her face. "Mr. Whitmore?" She picked up the spatula, turned back to the bacon. "You're up early." "Could say the same to you." He was already in his work clothes, hair, damp boots on. He poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove, not asking, not needing to. It was his kitchen on his ranch. She heard him lean against the far counter. "How are the biscuits looking?" "Done," she said. "Ready in about 10 minutes when they cool enough to handle." Silence. She could feel him still there, still watching. She cracked the first egg into the skillet without looking over her shoulder. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "Fine, thank you." "You're moving like something's wrong with your side." Her hand tightened on the spatula. "Long week," she said. "I'm fine." More silence. She cracked a second egg, a third. Her hands were steady. She'd gotten very good at making her hands steady, regardless of what the rest of her was doing. "How long you been up?" Jesse asked. 4. "That's early even for you." "Lot of mouths to feed." He didn't answer that. She could hear him drinking his coffee, slow, unhurried, the way he did everything. Jesse Whitmore was not a man who rushed. She'd noticed that about him early on. Boyd rushed at everything, meals, arguments, conclusions. Jesse moved like a man who'd already decided what he was going to do and was simply taking his time getting there. It made her nervous in a different way than Boyd made her nervous. "Mrs. Langley," he said again. "Sir?" "Turn around." It wasn't a request. She recognized the difference. Nora May turned, keeping the stove between them, spatula still in her hand. Jesse was looking at her the way she'd seen him look at an injured horse once. Not with pity. Nothing soft about it, just assessment. Calculation. The careful attention of a man who was deciding what needed to be done, and how fast. "How'd you hurt yourself?" he asked. "I didn't. You were braced against that counter when I came in like you couldn't stand without it." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." He set down his coffee cup. "I've seen enough people hurt to know the difference. Where's it coming from? Your side." Nora May's jaw tightened. "I said I'm fine, Mr. Whitmore. And I'm telling you I don't believe that." His voice was even no heat in it. "You don't have to tell me how. But I'd like to know how bad." She turned back to the eggs. "It's nothing. I slipped. I do that sometimes." "Big woman like you," Jesse said quietly. "You move too careful to slip." The words landed differently than she expected. Not cruel, just observational. She'd heard big woman her whole life in every possible tone, dismissive, mocking, apologetic, sometimes almost threatening. The way Jesse said it held none of those things, just fact. "I slipped on the porch steps," she said. 3 nights ago. I'm fine." 3 nights ago. Yes. Same night Boyd came in late from town. Her hand went still on the skillet. Jesse didn't say anything else. Just let that sit there. The kitchen door banged open, and Walt Dugan came in stomping mud from his boots, filling the room with cold morning air and the smell of horses. Behind him, Ray Covington and young Cody Holt, barely 19, perpetually hungry. "Morning, Mrs. Langley." Walt went straight to the coffee. "Morning." She moved without thinking, eggs to the plate, biscuits to the basket, potatoes into the serving bowl. This she could do. This she'd always been able to do, regardless of what else was happening in her body or her mind. Her size meant she covered ground in the kitchen, fast could carry the full serving pot without strain, could reach over men's heads to set plates without fumbling. She was good at this. Boyd had never once acknowledged that, but she knew it herself. More hands came in. The kitchen filled up with noise and appetite, and the easy roughness of working men who slept hard and woke hungry. Nora May moved through it all like she was made for it, which she supposed she was. Jesse stayed at the counter. She felt him watching every time she crossed the room. Boyd came in at 6:15, later than everyone else, moving with the stiff carefulness of a hangover. He didn't look at Nora May. He poured coffee, sat at the far end of the table, stared at the surface. Jesse was the first one to speak. "Late start, Boyd." Boyd grunted. "Horse kept me up." "Funny. Didn't sound like a horse I heard last night." The table went quiet. Not completely. Men kept chewing, kept drinking, but the conversation stopped. Walt and Ray exchanged a look. Cody kept his eyes on his plate. Boyd looked up. "You got something to say, Mr. Whitmore?" "Just making an observation." Jesse picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "Man drinks all day, comes home in a foul mood. Usually that mood's gotta go somewhere." Boyd's jaw worked slowly. "My wife is my business. She works for me," Jesse said. "That puts some of it in my business." "The hell it does." "The hell it doesn't." Jesse's voice stayed flat. Calm. The kind of calm that was more dangerous than shouting. "This is my ranch. Men who work here live by my standards, and my standards include how a man treats his family." Boyd's face was going red. "You can't tell me how to handle my wife. I can tell you how to behave on my property. That includes everyone on it." Jesse looked at him without blinking. "You don't like my standards? There are other ranches." For a moment, the only sound was the fire in the stove. Boyd shoved back from the table. "I'll be in the stables." He walked out without touching his food, the door swinging shut behind him. The kitchen exhaled. "More coffee, Mrs. Langley," Walt said, holding up his cup. "Of course." And the morning rolled forward like nothing had happened, like the air hadn't just shifted on its axis. But it had shifted. Nora May kept working. She kept her face neutral, her movement steady. She served and refilled and cleared like she'd done every morning for 6 months. But her hands were different now. Not shaking. Steadier. Someone had said something. It didn't fix anything. She knew that. She wasn't naive enough to think one conversation between two men changed the situation in the foreman's cabin at the edge of the property. Boyd would be angrier now. Cornered men got mean. She'd be the one who absorbed that meanness later in private where no one would see. But someone had noticed. Someone had looked at her and seen past the polite answer and the careful posture and said out loud in front of other people that what he was doing wasn't acceptable. In 6 months of carrying bruises under her dress that had never happened once. She was scrubbing the breakfast pots when Jesse came back into the kitchen an hour later. "What time do you usually take your break?" he asked. "I don't usually take one." "Take one now." She turned from the basin. "I have bread to start." "The bread can wait 10 minutes." He pulled out a chair at the end of the table, sat down, gestured at the other chair. "Sit down, Mrs. Langley." She wiped her hands on her apron. Sat. Up close, Jesse Whitmore had lines around his eyes that weren't there from laughing. She hadn't noticed that before. Hadn't let herself look at him directly enough to notice much of anything. Looking directly at men had been dangerous for long enough that she'd trained herself out of it. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want an honest answer." "All right." "Did Boyd do that to your ribs?" The question sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. Nora May looked at her hands. "Mrs. Langley." "If I say yes," she said quietly, "what does that change?" Jesse was quiet for a moment. "It changes what I do next. He's your ranch hand. I'm just your cook." "You're a person on my land who's been hurt," Jesse said. "That's all I need to know. I can't prove it. I'm not asking for proof. I'm asking for the truth." She looked up. His eyes were pale gray, the color of early morning sky, and they held hers without flinching. "He broke 3 ribs," she said, 3 nights ago, because the cornbread wasn't sweet enough." Jesse's jaw moved just once, like he was deciding something. "Before that," he asked, "before that there were other things." She kept her voice level. Clinical. She'd learned to describe it that way, like she was reporting about someone else, because that was the only way she could say it without coming apart. "My face, mostly. My arms. Nothing that showed above the collar if I was careful about what I wore." Jesse nodded slowly. How long? Since the beginning. 2 years. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. Outside, she could hear the hands moving around the yard horses, the distant sound of someone hammering a fence post. You have family anywhere? Jesse asked. My mother's in Ohio. We don't. She stopped. We don't have the kind of relationship where I could go back. Friends? Not nearby. Money of your own? No. He nodded again. Not surprised, she thought. Like he'd already known the shape of it, had just needed her to fill in the details. I want you to move into the main house, he said. Nora May blinked. Excuse me. There's a spare room. Back of the house has a lock on the inside of the door. I want you sleeping there instead of in that cabin. People will talk. Let them. Mr. Whitmore, I appreciate. Jesse. She paused. My name is Jesse, he said. You've been working in my kitchen for 6 months. Call me Jesse. Jesse. It felt strange in her mouth. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but Boyd won't accept this. He'll get angrier. He's not going to come into my house. You can't stop a man from going to his own wife. Watch me. He said it simply without bravado, the same way he said everything, like it was just the next logical step and he'd already mapped out all the steps after it. Tonight, you sleep in the spare room. Tomorrow we figure out the next part. Nora May looked at him. This man she barely knew. This man who had just spoken her secret out loud across his kitchen table and not flinched from any of it. Why? She asked. Why what? Why does this matter to you? You don't know me. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My mother had a first husband before my father. He was a bad man. Drank hit the whole picture. She stayed because she thought she had to. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. When my father finally helped her leave, she said afterward that the hardest part wasn't the leaving. The hardest part was that for years nobody had looked at her and said what was happening to her was wrong. His eyes came back to hers. I've been watching you for 6 months, Mrs. Langley. Watching you flinch when a door slams. Watching you ice your hands in the wash water when you think no one's looking. Watching you eat standing up because sitting down hurts too much. He paused. What's happening to you is wrong. Somebody should have said it before now. I'm saying it. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a very long time, but her throat closed in a way that made speaking difficult for a moment. Just tonight, she managed. Start with tonight. Lock the door. I'll deal with Boyd. He's going to be furious. Good. She looked at him for a long moment. This was not how her life worked. In Nora May's experience, people noticed things and looked away. Employers protected workers until the workers' problems became inconvenient. Men made speeches and then did nothing. She'd been navigating that reality for so long, she'd stopped expecting anything different. All right, she said. Tonight. Something in Jesse's posture shifted slightly. Not relief exactly. More like a task checked off a list, next task already visible. Good. He stood up. I'll show you the room after dinner. Right now I need to talk to Boyd. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. Jesse. She said his name before she'd decided to. He turned. Be careful. When he's cornered. I know what cornered men do. His voice was steady. I'm not worried about Boyd Langley. He walked out. Nora May sat at the empty table for a full minute. The fire kept burning. The bread she'd been about to start sat waiting. Outside she heard Jesse's voice, and then Boyd's, the second one rising, the first staying level. Then silence. She got up and started the bread. The confrontation with Boyd took place by the east fence, visible from the kitchen window if she stood at the right angle. She didn't stand and watch. She mixed flour and water and yeast and worked the dough with both hands, feeling the familiar pull in her arms, and she breathed and she listened to the silence that meant something had been settled. Boyd came in for lunch. He sat at the far end of the table, jaw tight, didn't look at her, didn't speak to her. That was the dangerous kind of quiet, the kind that collected itself like water behind a dam. She served the meal and kept her face even. Jessie ate at the head of the table, calm as always, talking with Walt about the north fence line and asking Cody about the new horse, normal, steady, like the morning hadn't happened. By mid-afternoon, Boyd was avoiding the main house entirely. At 5 o'clock, Clara Holt rode up to the ranch yard. She was the general store owner's daughter, sharp-eyed and plain-spoken, about 30, who sometimes came out to visit her brother Cody. She'd talked to Nora May maybe 4 or 5 times in passing, just enough that Nora May had registered her as someone who saw things. Clara didn't come to the kitchen. She went straight to Jessie's office. 20 minutes later, Jessie found Nora May in the pantry taking stock. "Clara's going to stay for dinner," he said. "And after dinner, she's going to help you move your things into the spare room." "You told her." "She figured it out herself. 3rd time she'd seen you moving wrong." Nora May looked at the shelf in front of her, counting flour bags by weight. "I didn't think anyone paid that much attention." "People pay more attention than you think," Jessie said. "The question is whether they do anything about it." He left. She kept counting. Dinner was full and loud the way it always was, and Nora May served and cleared and poured coffee, and Clara sat at the end of the bench and watched with quiet eyes and didn't say anything that drew attention. After the hands drifted off, Clara helped Nora May wash up. "You don't have to pretend with me," Clara said, drying a plate. "I've seen what I've seen." "I'm not pretending. You're doing that thing where you make your face do nothing." Clara set the plate down. "I do it too sometimes. It's a useful thing to know how to do, but you don't need it right now." Nora May scrubbed a pot. "I don't know what I need right now." "You need to sleep somewhere safe," Clara said. "That's enough for tonight. The rest can wait." Jessie showed her the room at 9 o'clock after Boyd had come back in from wherever he'd been and taken himself to the cabin, already well into his 2nd bottle by the sound of it. The spare room was small, clean, a real bed with a quilt, a window that looked out over the north pasture. "Lock on the inside," Jessie said, pointing to the bolt on the door. "Bathroom's next door. If you hear anything in the night, knock on the wall. My room is on the other side." "Mr. Whitmore." "Jessie." "Jessie." She looked around the room. It smelled like cedar and old wood. "Thank you." He nodded, started to leave, then stopped. "Mrs. Langley," he said, not turning around. "What you told me this morning about the ribs, about all of it. You didn't have to tell me that. I know it wasn't easy." "No," she admitted. "It wasn't. You're not going back to that cabin while I have anything to say about it." He said it the same way he said everything, flat, certain, already decided. "That's all I wanted you to know." He walked down the hall. His door closed. She heard the creak of floorboards, and then nothing. Nora May stood in the small room for a long moment. Then she closed the door, threw the bolt, and sat on the edge of the bed. She sat there for a while, hands in her lap, listening to the silence. In 6 months, she had not slept one night without one ear trained for the sound of Boyd's boots on the porch steps. Without calculating every time she heard his key in the lock, what kind of night it was going to be. Without lying rigid in the dark and praying to become small enough, invisible enough, quiet enough. This room was behind a locked door that Boyd couldn't open. This room was hers for the night. She took the first full breath she'd taken in 3 days. Her ribs screamed. She didn't care. She took another one anyway. Somewhere in the main house, a clock chimed 10. The ranch settled into its night sounds. The wind moved through the grass outside her window. Far off, something called an owl maybe, or a coyote. And the sound faded and was replaced by nothing. Nora May Calloway lay back on the bed without taking off her boots. She stared at the ceiling. She was not safe. Not really. Boyd was still on this ranch, still legally, her husband still 20 yards away in the foreman's cabin with his whiskey and his fury. But tonight, for the first time in 2 years, she was sleeping on the right side of a locked door. And that was something. That was everything. She was asleep before the clock struck 11, and she slept without dreaming, and she did not hear Boyd's boots on the porch steps because Boyd's boots never came. And in the morning, she woke to the pale gray of early dawn and lay still for a moment listening, and the only sound was the wind and the horses and the ranch waking up around her like it always did. She got up. She went to the kitchen. She started the fire. She made coffee, bacon, biscuits. By the time the hands came in, everything was ready. Nora Mae Calloway was still here, still standing, and something had begun. Boyd came to breakfast the next morning like nothing had happened. That was the thing about Boyd Langley that had always unnerved Nora Mae, more than the anger itself, the way he could reset. Wake up, splash water on his face. Walk into a room full of people and be perfectly convincingly normal. Smile at the right moments. Make a joke. Pass the salt without being asked. She'd watched him do it 100 times, and it still turned her stomach, because she knew what lived underneath the performance, and nobody else in the room did. He sat at the far end of the table, poured his coffee, nodded at Walt when Walt said something about the weather. His eyes found Nora Mae just once when she came around to refill cups. Nothing in that look that anyone else would have caught. Just a flat, steady pressure, like a thumb pressing down on a bruise to check if it still hurt. She kept moving, kept her face neutral. Poured his coffee last. Jesse was at the head of the table. He didn't look at Boyd directly, but Nora Mae noticed, and she was very good at noticing things that he tracked Boyd the way a man tracks weather. Peripheral constant ready. After breakfast, Boyd went to the stables without a word. Clara, who had stayed the night in the bunkhouse rather than ride back to town in the dark, caught Nora Mae's arm in the kitchen doorway. "He's going to try to talk to you alone today," Clara said quietly. "Don't let him. I know." "I mean it, Nora. Don't give him a private moment. Stay where people can see you." "I've been doing that my whole life," Nora Mae said. "Staying where people can see me doesn't usually help." Clara's jaw tightened. "It helps when Jesse Whitmore is one of the people who can see you." She wasn't wrong about that. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. Nora Mae scrubbed the breakfast pots, started bread, inventoried the cold room, prepped for lunch. She moved through the ranch house with the efficiency of long practice, and she kept her back to the walls when she could, and she kept doors in her sight line, and she noted every time she heard boots on the porch steps. Boyd's attempt came at 10:30. She was in the cold room pulling salt pork when she heard him behind her. She didn't turn around. She already knew it was him by the weight of the footstep, the specific drag of his left heel. "We need to talk," he said. "I'm working." She reached for the pork, kept her movements slow and deliberate. Don't show the fear. Fear invited escalation. She'd learned that in the first month. "You made me look bad yesterday." "I didn't do anything yesterday." "You slept in his house." His voice had that particular quiet to it, the careful, controlled kind that meant he was working very hard to stay level. "In front of every man on this ranch, you slept in the boss's house. He offered me a room. I took it. You're my wife. I'm aware of that." She turned around, salt pork in hand, and looked at him. He was filling the doorway the same way he always did when he wanted to remind her she was trapped. Boyd wasn't a large man, but he had a talent for making spaces feel smaller. "Boyd, I need to get back to the kitchen. We're going to settle this right now." "There's nothing to settle. You come back to the cabin tonight. We pretend none of this happened. Everything goes back to normal." "Normal," she repeated. "That's right." She looked at him for a moment. The old Nora Mae, the one from 2 years ago from last week, even would have weighed the cost of arguing versus the cost of compliance and chosen the quieter path. She knew this about herself. She'd been making that calculation so long it had become automatic, like breathing. Something had shifted since yesterday morning. She wasn't sure yet what to do with the shift, but it was there. "Normal isn't working for me anymore," she said. Boyd went very still. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me." "Nora Mae." His voice dropped. "You need to be very careful right now." "I know." She held the salt pork against her chest like a shield, which was absurd, but her hands needed to be holding something. "I'm being careful. I'm also telling you the truth." "The truth?" He almost laughed. The truth is, you've been running your mouth to the man who signs my pay, making me out to be some kind of monster. I didn't say a word to him. He saw. Saw what? Me, she said quietly. He saw me. The cold room went dead silent. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could see Boyd deciding something behind his eyes, calculating the same way she calculated weighing options, measuring distances. You think he cares about you, Boyd said finally. You think a man like Jesse Whitmore looks at a woman like you and sees anything worth caring about? She didn't answer. You're his cook, Nora. That's all you are. He took a step closer. A big, plain woman who makes decent biscuits. The moment you become trouble, you're gone. And then where are you? She'd asked herself that same question in the dark last night. She didn't have a good answer. But she'd noticed something interesting. Asking it didn't terrify her the way it used to. Step back, Boyd. Excuse me? I said step back. He didn't move. Boyd. Jesse's voice came from behind him. Nora May hadn't heard him coming. Neither had Boyd apparently, because he turned fast, shoulders going tight. Jesse was standing just outside the cold room doorway, one hand on the frame. He wasn't blocking Boyd. There was plenty of room to walk past, but his presence alone made the geometry of the situation change completely. You're needed in the north pasture, Jesse said. Ray's got a fence problem he can't sort on his own. I'm in the middle of something. Ray needs help now. Jesse's eyes moved briefly to Nora May, then back to Boyd. Whatever you're in the middle of can wait. Boyd held Jesse's gaze for a moment, that stretched long enough to become a statement. Then he turned and walked out. Jesse watched him go. Then he looked at Nora May. You all right? I told him normal wasn't working for me anymore. Jesse's eyebrow lifted slightly, which on his face counted as a strong reaction. How'd he take that? About how you'd expect. You need a minute. No. She moved past him back toward the kitchen. I need to get the bread in the oven. She heard what might have been a quiet sound of approval behind her, or maybe just the wind through the door. She didn't look back to find out. Lunch was tense, in a way that only Nora May and Jesse and possibly Clara could feel. Boyd ate without speaking. The other hands filled the silence with the usual talk about work. Young Cody kept glancing at his sister across the table, clearly aware of something without knowing exactly what. Walt ate 2 helpings of stew and asked whether there was cornbread left, and Nora May gave him the rest of the pan, and the meal moved forward the way meals do, regardless of what's happening beneath the surface of things. After the hands went back to work, Clara stayed to help clean up. He tried, Clara said. It wasn't a question. In the cold room. What did you say? Nora May told her. Clara set down the pot she was drying and looked at her with something that was very close to admiration. You said that to Boyd Langley. I did. Lord. Clara shook her head slowly. You've got more backbone than I gave you credit for. I gave him 2 years, Nora May said. I think I'm done giving him things. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You know this gets harder before it gets easier. I know. He's not going to accept it. I know that too. And the law. The law says I'm his wife. Nora May scrubbed the pot with more force than was strictly necessary. I'm aware of what the law says. Jesse knows a lawyer in Casper. Edmund Fry. Handles difficult cases. Nora May's hands stilled. He already looked into that. He looked into it last night. Clara said it matter-of-factly, like this was not an extraordinary thing. Before you'd even agreed to take the room. Nora May stood at the basin and thought about that. A man she'd spoken 15 words to in 6 months had spent his evening looking into lawyers on her behalf before she'd made a single decision about her own future. She didn't know what to do with that kind of thing. She had no practice receiving it. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, Clara said. I'm just telling you the option exists. Boyd came back to the ranch house at dinner. He was civil in the specific way of a man storing pressure, each polite word another layer added to something that was going to have to blow eventually. He asked Walt to pass the bread. He thanked Nora May for the meal, which he had never done once in 2 years. It was the most frightening thing he'd done all day. After dinner, Jesse asked Nora May to stay behind when the hands cleared out. They sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of the meal between them. Jesse's coffee, her cup of tea, the fire burning low. "Edmund Fry can be here by Thursday if I send word tomorrow," Jesse said. "Clara told me you'd already reached out." He nodded. "Didn't apologize for it or explain it. You don't have to meet with him, but I'd like you to know the door's open." "What would I even ask for?" "Divorce if you want it. On grounds of cruelty." The word sat on the table between them like something breakable. "This is 1883 Jesse." She said his name more easily now, she noticed. Women don't just walk away from marriages. Some do. And everyone talks about those women for the rest of their lives. People are already talking. His voice was steady. The question isn't whether they'll talk. The question is whether what you end up with is worth the talking. Nora May wrapped her hands around her tea. "I have no money. No family I can go to. No—" "You have a job," Jesse said. "You have a room in this house as long as you want it, and you have a lawyer who can explain your options." He paused. "Those are 3 things you didn't have 2 days ago." She looked at him across the table. The firelight was low enough that his face was half shadow, half warm light. He looked tired, she realized. She'd been so focused on managing her own fear that she hadn't considered he might be carrying something of his own. "This is costing you something," she said. "Having me here, the talk that's going to come. Let me worry about that. I'd feel better if I could worry about it a little." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. Jesse Whitmore's face didn't do full smiles easily, but something close. "Fair enough. Worry a little, but don't let it stop you from making the right decision." "How do I know what the right decision is?" "You already know," he said. "You've known for a while. You're just scared, which is reasonable. Any sane person would be scared." He stood up, picked up his cup. "Think about it tonight. We'll talk more in the morning." He was almost to the door when she said, "Jesse." He turned. "Why do you move so quiet?" she asked. "For a man your size." He looked faintly surprised by the question. Then he said, "My father used to say big men who make a lot of noise are men who want to be feared. Men who move quiet are men who want to see things clearly." He tilted his head. "I've always been more interested in seeing clearly." He walked out. Nora May sat at the table after he was gone. The fire crackled. The ranch was settling into its night sounds. She could hear very distantly movement from the direction of the foreman's cabin. Boyd probably, awake and thinking and building something she wouldn't be able to predict. She should have been frightened. She was frightened, a steady, practical kind of fear that lived in her chest and measured distances and calculated risks. But underneath it, something else had taken up residence in the last 48 hours. Something that felt uncomfortably like resolve. She thought about what Boyd had said in the cold room. A big, plain woman who makes decent biscuits. She'd been letting him define the edges of her value for 2 years. He'd handed her a very small box and told her that was all she was, and she'd been so beaten down by then that she'd started to believe the dimensions of the box. The thing was, she knew this kitchen. She knew it the way she knew her own hands. She could walk it in the dark, had walked it in the dark plenty of times. And she never broke anything, and never burned anything, and never forgot which burner ran hot and which one needed coaxing. She could feed 23 men 3 times a day and have it ready on time without writing a single thing down. She could read a pantry inventory and know 2 weeks out what they were going to run short of. She could make bread with her hands tied behind her back practically. Boyd called that decent biscuits. Jesse Whitmore had ridden out to 2 different ranches in her first month to ask who'd trained her and whether she was available for hire. She hadn't known that until Walt mentioned it offhandedly 2 months ago. She'd filed it away without knowing why. She thought about it now. She was still sitting at the table when she heard the cabin door open. She heard Boyd's boots on the porch boards. She heard them stop. He knew she wasn't in the cabin. He was standing out there in the dark, figuring out what to do with that information. After a long moment, she heard him go back inside. She let out a breath she'd been holding since she heard the door open. Then she got up, made sure the kitchen was locked up tight, and walked down the hall to the spare room. She threw the bolt. She sat on the edge of the bed. Tomorrow, she would talk to Jesse about Edmund Fry. Tomorrow, she would start thinking about what a future beyond Boyd Langley might actually look like, what shape it might take, what it might cost, and what it might be worth. Tomorrow she would face whatever Boyd had been building in that cabin all evening. But tonight, she was behind a locked door, and the ranch was quiet around her, and her ribs ached less than they had 3 days ago, and she was still here. She was still choosing to be here. That she was beginning to understand was not a small thing. She lay back on the bed and closed her eyes. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called high and lonesome, and the sound drifted off across the Wyoming dark. And then there was only the wind and the quiet, and Nora Mae Calloway breathing steadily through a night that was hers alone. Edmund Fry arrived on Thursday, the way lawyers tended to arrive, quietly with a leather satchel and an expression that gave nothing away. He was a small man, compact with silver at his temples, and the kind of careful eyes that missed nothing. Jesse brought him into the ranch house sitting room and called for Nora Mae, and she came in from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron, and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the two of them like she was still deciding whether to walk forward or walk back. She walked forward. "Mrs. Langley," Fry said, standing. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please sit down." She sat. Jesse moved to stand near the window. Not in the conversation, not outside. It just present the way he always was. "Mr. Whitmore tells me you may be interested in exploring your legal options," Fry said. "I want to know what they are," Nora Mae said, "before I decide anything." "That's sensible." Fry opened his satchel. "You've been married 2 years." "Yes, and the abuse began when—" she told him. She'd been practicing how to say it flat, factual, no more detail than necessary. She'd learned in the cold room conversation with Jesse that saying it plainly was actually easier than she'd expected once she'd done it once. The first time cracked something open. After that, it was just information. Fry wrote as she talked. He didn't react visibly to any of it, which she appreciated. She didn't need horror on his behalf. She needed someone to think clearly. "Physical evidence?" he asked. "3 ribs healed now. Some older scarring on my arms." She paused. "A doctor could probably confirm what healed wrong." "Witnesses. Mr. Whitmore. The ranch hands Walt Duggan saw bruises. Ray Covington heard things from outside the cabin. Young Cody Holt." She stopped. "He's 19. I don't want to pull him into something ugly." "He may be willing on his own," Jesse said from the window. "Let him decide." Fry looked up from his notes. "Mrs. Langley, I want to be direct with you because I think you'd prefer that." "I would. Divorce on grounds of cruelty is possible under Wyoming territorial law. It has been granted before, but it requires the petitioner, that's you, to demonstrate to a judge that the cruelty was consistent, severe, and not provoked." He held her gaze. "That last part is the one opposing counsel will go after. They'll suggest you provoked him. They'll question your character, your conduct as a wife, your fidelity." "I was faithful," she said evenly. "I don't doubt it, but Boyd Langley will say otherwise, and his lawyer will build a case around it." Fry put his pen down. "You're also living in your employer's home, which creates an obvious line of attack." "We're aware of that," Jesse said. "I'm sure you are. I'm telling Mrs. Langley because she needs to understand what she's walking into." Fry turned back to her. "The process will take months. Boyd will fight it. People will talk, or probably already talking. You'll have to stand in a courtroom and say out loud in front of everyone what he did to you." He paused. "Knowing all of that, do you want to proceed?" Nora Mae looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the cold room, about Boyd's voice saying a big plain woman who makes decent biscuits, about standing at the stove at 5 in the morning with 3 cracked ribs, making herself breathe shallow so the pain stayed manageable. Yes, she said. I want to proceed. Fry nodded and picked up his pen again. Then we'll file the petition next week. I'll need you to come to Casper to sign the documents. I'll bring her, Jesse said. Boyd was served the papers on a Tuesday. Nora May wasn't there when it happened. She was in the kitchen making lunch when she heard his voice from outside, loud enough to carry through the walls, and she set down her knife very carefully and breathed and waited. The voice got louder. Then it stopped. Walt came in 10 minutes later. He's gone, Walt said. Rode off toward town. Is he coming back? Walt was quiet for a beat too long. Don't know, he said. He came back 3 days later, and he didn't come to the ranch. He went to town instead, and what he did in town was worse than anything he could have done on the property. Clara was the one who told her. She rode out on a Friday morning, looking like she'd bitten something sour. He's been talking, Clara said, sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on. To anyone who'll stand still long enough. Mrs. Patterson, the Reverend's wife, the men at the saloon, the town council, all of them. Nora May kept stirring the pot on the stove. What's he saying? That you left him for Jesse. That it was going on before you ever moved into the main house. Clara's voice was tight. He's calling you an adulteress, Nora. Saying Jesse stole you away with promises of money and a soft bed. The spoon made slow circles in the pot. That's a lie, Nora May said. I know that. Jesse never... She stopped. There's been nothing between us except work and decency. I know that too. Clara leaned forward. But people want a story, and Boyd's giving them one with a villain and a victim and a scandalous woman in the middle. It's the kind of story that travels fast. Nora May put the lid on the pot and turned around. How bad is it? Clara took a breath. Mrs. Patterson crossed the street when she saw me coming out of the general store this morning, because she knows I'm friendly with you. She held Nora May's gaze. The Reverend's wife told my mother that she's praying for your soul. My soul is fine. I know it is. Clara stood up. But you need to know what you're walking into next time you go to town. They've already made up their minds, some of them. Boyd's been very convincing. Nora May sat down at the table. The pot bubbled quietly behind her. She'd known this was coming. Fry had warned her. Jesse had warned her. She'd warned herself in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come. Knowing something was coming and feeling it arrive were two entirely different things. What do I do? She asked. You hold your head up, Clara said. You go to town, you look people in the eye, you don't hide. The moment you hide, you look guilty. I'm not guilty of anything. Then act like it. Jesse heard about the talk the same day. He came to find her that evening in the kitchen, and she could see by the set of his jaw that he already knew. I want to go to town, he said. Set some people straight. Don't. Nora, I mean it, Jesse. If you defend me, it proves his story. People will say you're only defending me because you have something to protect. She looked at him steadily. This has to come from me. My word, my witnesses, my truth in front of a judge. You stepping in just makes it easier for them to believe Boyd's version. Jesse looked like the argument cost him something. You shouldn't have to manage this alone. I'm not alone. She said it and meant it, which surprised her slightly. 6 months ago, she'd been the most alone she'd ever been in a room full of people. I have you, Clara Fry, the hands who'll testify. That's not alone. She paused. But the fight has to be mine. He looked at her for a long moment. All right. All right. You're right, he said. I don't like it, but you're right. She almost smiled. You don't say that easily, do you? No, he admitted. I don't. The following Sunday, Nora May went to town. She wore her best dress, dark blue, no patches, collar straight, and she rode in with Clara, and she walked down the main street of Casper like she had every right to be there, which she did, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. The looks started immediately. Mrs. Patterson turned away from the window of the millinery shop. Two women outside the church went quiet when Nora May walked past and then started back up again the moment she was 10 feet beyond them. The blacksmith's wife said good morning, but didn't meet her eyes. A man she didn't recognize stared at her from across the street with unconcealed curiosity. Clara walked beside her with her chin up and her eyes forward, and Nora May matched her stride for stride, and they went into the general store and bought flour and salt and lamp oil. And Nora May answered the shopkeeper's careful, distant politeness with complete, unhurried calm. On the way out, a woman stopped her. She was older, maybe 60, with iron gray hair and a face that looked like it had seen a lot and forgotten very little. Nora May didn't know her name. She braced herself. "Miss Langley," the woman said. "Mrs. Langley." Nora May corrected automatically, though she wasn't sure how much longer that would be accurate. "Harriet Voss." The woman extended her hand, which was unexpected enough that Nora May shook it. "I run the boarding house on 5th Street. "Mrs. Voss." Harriet Voss studied her for a moment with those careful eyes. "My first husband hit me," she said quietly, but without embarrassment. "For 4 years. I told no one because I was ashamed and because I thought the shame was mine to carry." She paused. "It wasn't. I understand that now. But I understood it too late to do anything except wait for him to drink himself into the ground." Nora May didn't know what to say. She said, "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry for me. I had 30 good years after." Harriet Voss squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "What you're doing takes courage. Don't let them make you forget that." She glanced toward the churchwomen across the street with an expression of brisk contempt. "Some of those women know exactly what happens behind closed doors in this town, and they choose not to know. That's their failure, not yours." She walked away before Nora May could respond. Clara leaned close. "Who was that?" "I have no idea," Nora May said. "But I think she just saved my Sunday." They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, and Nora May kept her face toward the road ahead and replayed Harriet Voss's words until they stopped shaking. 2 weeks before the hearing, Boyd made his final move. Fry sent word from Casper Boyd had filed a counter-petition: abandonment, adultery, theft of household property. Theft. Nora May read the document twice at the kitchen table while Jessie stood by the window. She set it down. "He's saying I stole from him," she said. "He's saying you took household goods when you moved into the main house." Jessie's voice was controlled. "Which is garbage. You brought your own clothes and nothing else." Can he win with that? Fry says no, but it complicates the picture. Jessie turned from the window. "It makes you look petty. Makes the whole thing messier. That's the point." She folded the document carefully crease by crease. "He doesn't need to win. He just needs to make enough noise that the judge can't see clearly." Jessie sat down across from her. "Fry's filing a response. He wants to meet with you again before the hearing." "I know." She put the document aside. "Jessie, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "If I lose this hearing," she held up her hand when he started to speak, "I need to say the rest of it. If I lose, the judge could send me back to Boyd, legally." "That's not going to—" "If I lose," she said again steadily, "what happens?" Jessie was quiet for a moment. Really quiet, the thinking kind. "Then we find another way," he said. "We appeal. We go to a different court. We find a judge in a different county. And if none of that works, then you don't go back to him. I don't care what any judge says." "That's not a legal answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He met her eyes. "But it's the true one." She looked at him across the table. She'd been looking at Jessie Whitmore differently lately, and she knew it, and she suspected he knew it too, and neither of them had said a word about it, because the timing was spectacularly wrong, and they were both sensible enough to understand that. But it was there, this quiet, inconvenient thing, and she didn't quite know what to do with it, except set it aside and deal with what was in front of her first. "All right," she said. Then I'm not going to lose. Walt knocked on the kitchen doorframe that evening after supper. He had his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, which was his tell for discomfort. "Mrs. Langley, could I speak to you a minute?" "Of course, Walt." He came in, sat down uninvited, which he'd never done before, turned his hat another rotation. "Heard Boyd filed that counterpetition. Word travels." "Yes, ma'am." He looked at the table. "I got a daughter back in Colorado, 18 years old. Her name's June." He paused. "I've been thinking about June a lot this past week." Nora May waited. "If anyone ever did to June what Boyd's done to you," Walt said, "and somebody who could help decided it wasn't their business." He stopped, set his hat on the table. "I'd testify, at the hearing. Whatever you need me to say about what I saw, I'll say it." "Walt, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." His jaw was set. "That's the point of it." The night before the hearing, Nora May couldn't sleep. She lay in the spare room, staring at the ceiling, running through everything Fry had prepared her for. The questions Boyd's lawyer would ask. The way they'd frame her decision to leave as abandonment, her friendship with Jesse as evidence of adultery, her size and her plainness as evidence of what exactly she wasn't sure, but she'd felt it in their sessions with Fry. The implication that a woman like her, heavyset and unremarkable by conventional standards, surely couldn't expect a man like Boyd to treat her with gentleness. Surely she should have been grateful for what she had. She'd heard that logic before. Not stated outright, but present in the silences in the way certain people looked at her when Boyd smiled his easy smile, and she stood next to him, looking nothing like what a man might choose if he had better options. She'd spent a long time believing it herself, that the bruises were the price of being chosen at all. She got up at 2 a.m. and went to the kitchen. Jesse was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk much of, and when she came through the door, he just looked at her and didn't say anything, which she appreciated more than any greeting. She put the kettle on, sat across from him. "You ready?" he asked eventually. "I don't think ready is something I'm capable of being for this." "Fair." "Are you?" she asked. "I've been ready since the morning I walked into my kitchen and found you holding yourself up against the stove." He said it without drama, just flat and true. "I've been waiting for the chance to say in front of witnesses what I saw." She wrapped her hands around her tea. "They're going to come after you too. Boyd's lawyer. They'll imply things. Let them imply. Your reputation, Nora." He said her name quietly without the formal prefix for the first time. Just her name. "My reputation is mine to spend how I choose. I choose to spend it on something worth spending it on." She looked at him across the table. This man who moved quiet through his own house and said what he meant and did not say more than he meant, and she thought about what Harriet Voss had said. It takes courage, and she thought about June Duggan, who was 18 in Colorado and didn't know yet what could happen to a woman in a closed room with the wrong man. She thought about the hearing, about the courtroom, about standing up in front of everyone, the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Patterson, the whole gossiping machinery of Casper, Wyoming in 1883, and saying out loud without apology what Boyd Langley had done to her for 2 years and why she was worth more than he had ever given her. She was terrified. She was going anyway. "Jesse," she said. "Yeah, whatever happens tomorrow." She stopped. "Thank you. For seeing me. For doing something about it." She paused. "Not many people would have." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "More people should." The fire crackled. The clock on the wall moved through the small hours. They sat together in the kitchen until the dark. Outside, the window softened. And then Nora May got up and started the fire in the stove, and Jesse got up and put on his coat. And the ranch woke up around them the way it always did, indifferent to the fact that this morning was not like the other mornings. This morning, Nora May Calloway was going to walk into a courtroom and ask a judge to give her back her life. She cracked the first egg into the skillet with a steady hand. Whatever came next, she was ready enough. The courthouse in Casper smelled like old wood and pipe tobacco, and the particular kind of dread that collects in places where people's fates get decided by strangers. Nora May, sat on the hard bench outside the courtroom with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight and her eyes fixed on the middle distance the way she'd learned to fix them when she needed to look composed, and wasn't entirely sure she was. Clara sat on her left, Jessie on her right. Fry was already inside arranging papers. Walt and Ray sat 2 benches back, hats in their hands, not speaking. Down the hall, Boyd stood with his lawyer. His lawyer's name was Monroe Talbot, and he'd come up from Cheyenne, which meant Boyd had spent money he didn't have on someone who knew how to make juries doubt women. Talbot was tall, expensively dressed with a manner that managed to be simultaneously respectful and dismissive, a useful combination in a courtroom, Fry had warned her. "He'll be polite while he takes you apart," Fry had said. "Don't let the politeness fool you." Boyd caught her eye from down the hall. He looked good. That was the thing that always struck her. Boyd Langley cleaned up beautifully. Freshly shaved, dark coat hair combed. He looked like a man who'd been wronged, and he wore it easily because he'd been practicing the expression for months. He held her gaze for a moment, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder. Certainty. He thought he was going to win. She looked away first. Not because she was backing down, because she was saving herself for where it mattered. "You all right?" Clara said quietly. "Ask me in 2 hours." The courtroom doors opened. A clerk appeared. Langley versus Langley. Judge Alton Graves presiding. Nora May stood up, her legs held. She walked into the courtroom. Judge Alton Graves was older than she'd expected, somewhere north of 65, with a white beard trimmed close, and eyes the color of creek water, pale and clear, and giving nothing away. He looked at the papers in front of him when they filed in, not at the parties, which Fry had told her was actually a good sign. Judges who looked up right away were usually looking for reasons to dismiss things quickly. Judges who read were judges who intended to pay attention. She sat beside Fry. Jessie and Clara took seats directly behind her. Talbot arranged himself at the opposing table with practiced ease, like a man who found courtrooms comfortable, which he probably did. Boyd sat beside him and folded his hands on the table and looked exactly like what he wanted to look like. Graves looked up. "This is a petition for divorce on grounds of cruelty, filed by Nora May Langley against Boyd Langley." His voice was dry and even. "Mr. Langley has filed a counter-petition alleging abandonment, adultery, and theft." He set the papers down. "We'll hear from the petitioner first. Mr. Fry." Fry stood. "Thank you, Your Honor." He was brief in his opening. He laid out the timeline. Marriage abuse beginning within weeks, 6 months of escalating violence, the incident with the ribs. He didn't editorialize. He gave dates where he had them, and described injuries where he had documentation. Nora May had asked him to keep it plain, and he had. Then Talbot stood for his opening, and he was anything but plain. He told a story about a restless wife who had grown dissatisfied with her honest, hard-working husband. A woman who had found a wealthier man willing to offer her comfort, and had fabricated a narrative of abuse to extract herself from her marriage vows without bearing the moral consequence of her own choices. He said the word fabricated with careful, sorrowful emphasis, like it cost him something to apply it to a woman. Nora May kept her face still. Fry called her to the stand first. She walked to the witness chair and sat down, and looked at Judge Graves rather than at Boyd, which Fry had told her to do, and which turned out to be useful because Graves's expression was at least neutral, while Boyd's was the controlled smile of a man watching something he'd already predicted play out the way he predicted it. "Mrs. Langley," Fry began, "when did the abuse begin?" 3 weeks after the wedding," she said. "Maybe 4. The exact day I don't remember clearly, but I remember what he said afterward." "What did he say?" "That I'd caused it. That if I was better at listening, it wouldn't happen." "Did you believe him?" She paused. "For a while, yes." "Why?" "Because that's what he told me every time. And when a person tells you the same thing enough times in a row, the telling starts to feel like truth, even when it isn't." She looked at Graves. It took me a while to understand the difference. Can you describe the nature of the physical violence? She described it. She'd practiced being clinical about it, and the practice held mostly. She went through it the way you go through a list. Face, arms, ribs, the particular incident that had finally fractured something in her beyond just bone. She did not look at Boyd. She kept her voice level and her hands still in her lap. When Fry sat down, Talbot stood up. He smiled at her. "Mrs. Langley, you've made some very serious allegations against your husband today." "They're not allegations," she said. "They're what happened." Talbot's smile didn't waver. "You lived with Mr. Langley for 2 years. During that time, did you ever seek medical attention for any of these alleged injuries?" "No." "Why not?" "We had no money for doctors." "Or perhaps because there were no injuries serious enough to require a doctor." "I had 3 broken ribs," she said. "I decided a broken rib doesn't require a doctor the same way I decide every morning to cook breakfast with bruised arms, because stopping costs more than continuing." Talbot moved on smoothly. "You're currently residing in the home of your employer, Jesse Whitmore." "Yes. In the main house. In a separate room with a bolt on the inside of the door. But in the main house, not in the bunkhouse or a separate structure, in Mr. Whitmore's personal home. He offered it as a safe place. I accepted." "How generous of him." Talbot walked slowly in front of the witness stand. "Mrs. Langley, are you romantically involved with Jesse Whitmore?" "No." "Has there ever been any romantic involvement between you?" "No." "You spend evenings together in his kitchen. You eat at his table." "I cook his meals. That's my employment." "You confided in him about your marriage. Personal, intimate details. He noticed I was injured and asked me directly. I told him the truth." Talbot tilted his head. "Isn't it possible, Mrs. Langley, that what you experienced in your marriage was a normal degree of marital friction, disagreements, tensions, the ordinary difficulties of 2 people building a life, and that your perception of those experiences was shaped by your feelings for another man?" She looked at him steadily. 3 broken ribs is not marital friction." "According to you." "According to Dr. Samuel Brent, who examined me and will testify to the calcification pattern on those ribs, which is consistent with fracture and healing." She kept her voice even. "You can call it my perception if you like. The bones healed the same way, regardless of what we call it." Something flickered behind Talbot's eyes. He hadn't expected her to bring up Brent directly. "No further questions," he said. She walked back to her seat. Under the table, Clara pressed her knee once brief and firm. Fry called Dr. Samuel Brent next. Brent was precise and unhurried on the stand, the kind of witness who made juries believe things without trying to persuade them. He described the physical findings in medical language, and then translated each point into plain English when Fry asked him to. 3 ribs. Consistent fracture pattern. Healed without proper setting, which meant they'd healed wrong. Additionally, muscular bruising on both upper arms, consistent with gripping force applied repeatedly over an extended period of time. Talbot tried to shake him on cross-examination. "You didn't examine Mrs. Langley at the time of the alleged injuries." "That's correct." "So you cannot say with certainty when these injuries occurred." "I can say with certainty that they occurred," Brent said. "The evidence of the injuries is not in dispute. Only the cause and the pattern of injury is not consistent with accident." "How many ways can ribs be broken, doctor?" "Several. Falls, collisions, direct impact." Brent folded his hands in his lap. "The combination of findings, the rib fractures, the bilateral upper arm bruising, consistent with a gripping pattern rather than an impact pattern. The location and distribution of old scarring taken together. These are consistent with repeated deliberate force applied by another person. They are not consistent with clumsiness." Graves wrote something down. Walt took the stand after Brent. He was visibly uncomfortable turning his hat in his hands, even as he set it aside. But what he said was simple, and he said it without embellishment. "I saw bruises on her arms 3 separate times," Walt said. "Different bruises each time. New ones, not the same ones healing. And I heard things from outside that cabin at night that a man doesn't forget easy." "What kind of things?" Fry asked. His voice loud and ugly. "Something breaking once, and her not a sound from her." Walt's jaw worked. "That's the part that stays with you. All that noise from him and from her nothing. Like she'd learned not to make noise." Talbot kept his cross-examination of Walt short, which was the smart move. Walt wasn't a man who could be rattled easily, and trying to rattle him would only make him seem more credible. Clara took the stand and was exactly what she'd been every day since this started: precise, direct, and completely immovable. "I've known Nora Mae Langley for 8 months," she said. "In that time I never saw her be anything other than exactly what she says she is. I never saw anything between her and Jesse Whitmore that was improper. And I've known Jesse Whitmore my whole life, and a man who would use a woman's desperation to get her into his home is not a man I recognize." "You're her friend," Talbot said on cross. "You're clearly sympathetic to her." "I'm sympathetic to people who are being hurt," Clara said. "That's not bias. That's just being a decent human being." Then it was Boyd's turn. He walked to the stand the way he walked into every room, like he already knew how the room would respond to him. He sat down, adjusted his coat, looked at Judge Graves with the expression of a patient, reasonable man. Talbot led him through it carefully. The marriage, the home they'd built, the difficulties — he used that word, difficulties — they'd experienced. His work on the ranch. His shock when Nora Mae had moved into the main house without his knowledge or consent. His devastation when he'd been served with papers. "I love my wife," Boyd said. "I have never once raised my hand to her." The lie landed in the courtroom like a stone, dropped flat into still water. Nora Mae kept her eyes on Graves and breathed evenly. "Then how do you explain the injuries Dr. Brent described?" Fry asked on cross-examination. "She's always been clumsy," Boyd said easily. "Trips, bumps into things. A woman her size moving through a small kitchen, things happen." "A woman her size," Fry repeated. "I don't mean anything by it. I'm just saying accidents happen. 3 broken ribs from kitchen accidents." "I wasn't there when it happened. I don't know exactly." "You don't know how your wife broke 3 ribs. She told me she fell." "She told Mr. Whitmore the same thing initially," Fry said. "She also told him the truth when he pressed. Did you ever press?" Boyd's jaw tightened slightly. "Of course. She said she was fine. I believed her." "You believed her?" "That's what I said." "So your testimony is that your wife sustained 3 broken ribs, and you accepted her explanation without question, never suggested a doctor, never followed up. We couldn't afford— Mr. Whitmore tells me you spent $43 in one evening at a poker game the week the ribs were broken." Fry held up a document. "That's nearly 3 weeks' wages, but a doctor was out of the question." Boyd's face went carefully blank. "No further questions," Fry said. Jesse was the last witness. He took the stand without ceremony, set his hat on his knee, and looked at Judge Graves with the same directness he looked at everything. Fry kept his questions simple. "What did you observe, Mr. Whitmore?" "I came into my kitchen before dawn on a morning in October," Jesse said. "Mrs. Langley was at the stove. She was holding herself up with both hands on the counter. When she turned around, I could see from the way she was breathing and the way she moved that she had broken ribs." He paused. "I've had broken ribs twice in my life. I know what they look like on a person." "What did you do?" "I asked her what happened. She said she fell. I didn't believe her." He said it without apology. "I've known clumsy people, and I've known hurt people, and they don't move the same way." "What happened next?" "I spoke to her husband at breakfast, made it clear that what I was seeing wasn't acceptable on my ranch." Jesse's voice was even unhurried. "Boyd wasn't interested in what I had to say. He left breakfast early." "And Mrs. Langley?" "I offered her a room in the main house. She accepted." Talbot stood for his cross. "Mr. Whitmore, you're a wealthy man." "I do all right." "You own 12,000 acres of Wyoming territory, correct?" "Thereabouts." "And Mrs. Langley is your cook?" "She manages my household," Jesse said. "Cooking is part of that, yes." When you offered her a room in your home, were you motivated purely by concern for her welfare? Yes. Nothing else. Jesse looked at Talbot with the particular patience of a man who finds a question unworthy of hurry. I'll tell you what I told myself the morning I saw her holding herself up against that stove. I thought about my mother. First husband hit her. Nobody did anything for a long time. His voice didn't change pitch or speed. I decided a long time ago that if I ever had the chance to do something, I'd do it. That's what motivated me. You're welcome to believe something different if it suits your case better. Talbot shifted. You've allowed Mrs. Langley to remain in your home throughout this process. Months. That's right. You've paid her legal fees. I've helped where I could. Doesn't that create an obligation? A dependency? Perhaps even a dynamic that could be described as... No, Jesse said. Talbot blinked. You didn't let me finish. You were going to suggest that my helping her means she's beholden to me in some way that compromises her testimony or her character, Jesse said. The answer is no. Nora Mae Langley has worked for everything she has in my house. She earns her wage. She earns her room. She doesn't owe me a single thing except the cooking, which is excellent. He held Talbot's gaze. If that's what you were going to suggest, the answer is no. If you had something different in mind, I apologize, and I'm ready to hear it. A sound moved through the courtroom. Not quite laughter. Something between a breath and a recognition. Graves made a note. Talbot sat down. When it was done, Graves called a recess and said he'd have a decision in the morning. One more night of not knowing. They rode back to the ranch mostly in silence. Clara sat in the back of the wagon and occasionally said things under her breath about Monroe Talbot's parentage that were not entirely appropriate for mixed company. Walton Ray had ridden out ahead. Jesse drove. Nora Mae sat beside him and watched the Wyoming land roll by, and thought about Boyd's face when Fry had asked about the poker money, the way it went blank. That blankness was the tell Boyd was very good at performing emotion, but when he was caught off guard, the performance paused for half a second, and in that half second, you could see there was nothing underneath it but calculation. She wondered if Graves had seen it. Jesse, she said. Yeah. You were good in there. He was quiet for a moment. I just said what was true. Not everyone can do that under pressure. You did. She thought about that. She supposed she had. She'd sat in that chair in front of a room full of people who had already decided what they thought about her, and she'd said the true things plainly, and she hadn't come apart. I was terrified, she said. I know. He glanced at her sideways. You didn't show it. I've had a lot of practice not showing things. He returned his eyes to the road. You won't have to practice that anymore. One way or another. She looked at the horizon. The sun was getting low, painting everything the color of an old scar, orange fading to red, fading to purple at the edges. Beautiful and a little brutal, the way Wyoming sunsets tended to be. What if Graves rules against me? She said. Not for the first time. But this time it felt different, more immediate, more real, the courtroom still fresh in her body. Then we go back, Jesse said. Different county, different judge, different approach. Fry knows 2 other lawyers who've handled appeals. That could take years. Yes. And in the meantime, you stay where you are, and Boyd Langley doesn't come within 100 yards of you. His voice was the same flat, settled thing it always was. I don't need a judge's permission for that. She almost said something else. Almost reached across the space between them on the wagon seat and said the thing that had been sitting in her chest since the courtroom, since she'd watched him look Monroe Talbot in the eye and say the answer is no with complete and total calm. She didn't say it. The timing was still wrong, and she was still sensible enough to know that. But she thought about it. That night, the ranch was quiet in the way of held breath. The hands went to bed earlier than usual. Clara stayed in the spare room next to Nora Mae's, which she'd started doing 2 weeks ago, without either of them suggesting it formally. Nora Mae lay on her bed with her eyes open and listened to Wyoming settle into the dark around her. She went through the day in pieces, Graves's pen, moving waltz-turned hat, the sound of Boyd's voice saying, "I have never once raised my hand to her smooth as river water." The kind of lie that got easier the more you told it. She thought about what Graves had written down. She thought about the morning this had all started, standing at that stove with her hands on the counter and the smell of burning bacon and the knowledge bone deep that another morning had arrived and she was still in it. She'd thought then that she had no options, that the math of her life only worked one way. The math had changed. She didn't know yet how the judge would run those numbers. But she knew one thing she hadn't known 8 weeks ago, standing at that stove, silent and trying to disappear. She wasn't trying to disappear anymore. She closed her eyes. She breathed steadily through the dark. And she waited for morning to come and bring with it whatever it was going to bring. Morning came the way difficult mornings always do, too fast and without ceremony. One moment Nora May was lying in the dark, listening to the ranch breathe around her, and the next there was pale light under the door, and the sound of Clara moving in the next room, and the smell of coffee that Jessie had already started before anyone else was up. She lay still for exactly 1 minute. Then she got up, washed her face, put on her best dress for the second day in a row, and went to the kitchen. Jessie handed her a cup without a word. They drank their coffee standing at opposite ends of the kitchen counter, and neither of them said anything about what the morning was, and that was exactly right. By 8 o'clock, they were back in the Casper courthouse. The room was fuller than it had been the day before. Word had traveled the way word always traveled, in small territories, fast and with embellishment, and people had come to see how it ended. Nora May felt their presence behind her, like a physical weight, as she took her seat beside Fry. She didn't look back. She'd learned in the last 2 months that looking back cost energy she needed for other things. Boyd was already at his table. Talbot was beside him, papers arranged, expression composed. Boyd looked like he'd slept well, which either meant he was confident or that he'd been drinking, and from where she sat, she couldn't tell which. Jessie settled into the seat directly behind her. Clara sat on his left. Walt and Ray were 2 rows back. Cody Holt, who had come of his own accord without anyone asking him, sat at the end of the bench with his hat in both hands, and his young face set in an expression of anxious determination that almost broke her heart. Judge Graves entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. Graves set his papers on the bench, adjusted his spectacles, and looked out at the room with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things in courtrooms and been surprised by very few of them. "I've reviewed the testimony from yesterday's proceedings," he said. His voice was the same dry, measured thing it had been throughout. "I've also reviewed the depositions, the medical documentation, the counter-petition filed by Mr. Langley, and the responses filed by Mr. Fry on behalf of the petitioner." The room was absolutely silent. "Divorce is not a matter this court takes lightly," Graves continued. "Marriage is a legal contract with significant social and moral weight, and the dissolution of that contract requires clear and convincing evidence that continuation would cause ongoing harm to one or both parties." He paused. "The bar is high. It should be high." Nora May's hands were folded in her lap. She pressed them together slightly harder. "However," Graves said, and that word landed in the courtroom like a stone through glass, "the bar is not insurmountable." He looked down at his papers. The petitioner's testimony was consistent, specific, and credible. The medical evidence corroborates her account of at least one significant injury. The witness testimony, while not eyewitness to specific acts of violence, establishes a pattern of observable injury and fear over an extended period. Graves removed his spectacles and looked up. The respondent's testimony contained several inconsistencies, most notably regarding his knowledge of his wife's injuries and his use of household funds during the period in question. Boyd's jaw moved. The respondent's counter-allegations of adultery are not supported by any credible evidence presented in these proceedings. The counter-allegation of theft is similarly unsupported. Graves set his spectacles back on his nose. The counter-petition is dismissed in full. Talbot made a small sound. Boyd turned to look at him. "On the matter of the original petition," Graves said, and every person in the room leaned forward by some fraction of an inch without knowing they were doing it. I find that the petitioner has met the evidentiary standard for divorce on grounds of cruelty. The pattern of injury, the credibility of testimony, and the corroborating medical evidence are sufficient to satisfy the requirements of Wyoming territorial law. He looked directly at Nora May. The marriage between Nora May Langley and Boyd Langley is hereby dissolved. Mrs. Langley is restored to her prior legal name, Nora May Calloway, and is entitled to all rights and protections afforded to a single woman under territorial law. Graves banged his gavel once clean and final. This court is adjourned. The room erupted, not in cheering, this wasn't that kind of room, but in the sudden release of held breath in voices overlapping in the scrape of bench legs against the floor. Fry was shaking her hand. Clara was gripping her shoulder from behind. Walt said something behind her that she didn't catch. She was aware of all of it at a remove, like it was happening just slightly outside the glass of her hearing. Dissolved. Nora May Calloway. She stood up. Her legs were steady. She turned and saw Clara's face, eyes bright and jaw working like she was deciding whether to cry. And she saw Walt nodding slowly with his hat pressed against his chest. And she saw Cody Holt, 19 years old, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath since yesterday. And she saw Jesse. He was standing very still in the row behind her, and his expression was the quietest version of relief she'd ever seen on a human face. Not joy, exactly. Not celebration. Just the look of a man who'd been bracing for something for a long time, and had finally set the weight down. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. Across the aisle, Boyd pushed back from his table. He looked at her once, just once, and whatever he'd planned to feel at this moment, whatever performance he'd prepared, it wasn't available to him. For the first time in 2 years, Boyd Langley's face showed something completely unmanaged. Something raw and ugly and real. Then Talbot took his arm and steered him toward the door, and Boyd went, and the door closed behind him, and he was gone. She breathed. Clara grabbed both her hands. You did it. We did it. Don't do that. You did it. Clara squeezed hard. You stood up in front of all these people, and you told the truth, and you did not flinch. Don't spread that out to everyone else. Keep that one. Nora May kept it. Fry shook her hand a second time more formally. Congratulations, Miss Calloway, he said, and the name sounded strange and right in equal measure. I'll have the formal documents to you by week's end. If Boyd attempts any further legal action, which I don't anticipate, you contact me immediately. Thank you, Mr. Fry, for everything. Thank yourself, he said, which she was beginning to realize was what competent people said when they wanted you to understand they'd only done what was possible because you'd done what was hard. They filed out of the courthouse into the October morning. The air outside was cold and clean, and the sky over Casper was the particular blue that only happened in Wyoming in autumn, deep and enormous and indifferent to everything happening beneath it, which Nora May had always found oddly comforting. The world didn't rearrange itself around human trouble. It just kept being itself, which meant there was always something bigger than the trouble. Harriet Voss was standing on the courthouse steps. She was wearing her good coat, and she had clearly come specifically for this because the boarding house was on the other side of town, and Harriet Voss was not a woman who made unnecessary journeys. She looked at Nora May and nodded once the way women of her generation nodded, when words would have been insufficient, and they knew it. Nora May nodded back. That was enough. They rode back to the ranch in a different kind of silence than the one they'd ridden in that morning. That morning's silence had been the silence of waiting. This one was the silence of something finished, of air moving back into a space that had been held too long. Clara talked enough for all of them, which was normal and welcome. Jesse drove and said very little, which was also normal. Nora May watched the land and let it settle into her, the dried grass and the gray rock, and the sky pressing down huge and blue, and thought about what Graves had said. Restored to her prior legal name. As though she'd been somewhere else for 2 years and had now been returned. Which was, she supposed, more accurate than most legal language tended to be. Nora May Calloway. She turned it over in her mind, like something found at the bottom of a pocket, something she'd forgotten she was carrying. When they pulled into the ranch yard, the other hands were waiting. Not formally, they had work to do, and had been doing it, but they were in the yard when the wagon came in, which was not accidental. Walt climbed down and said something brief to Ray that made Ray nod. Cody jumped from the wagon and went straight to the horses, like he needed to do something with his hands. Jesse helped her down from the wagon without making it a production. "Well," Walt said. "She won," Clara said. Walt looked at Nora May directly. "Congratulations, ma'am." He said it simply the way he said everything, but there was something underneath it, that she recognized the particular quality of relief in a person who had done a hard right thing and discovered it had been worth the doing. "Thank you, Walt," she said, "for everything you said in there." He shook his head. "Don't thank me for that. I'm thanking you anyway." He put his hat on and went back to work, which was exactly what she'd expected him to do. That evening, Clara made dinner for the first time, declaring that Nora May was not cooking her own celebration meal, and the result was enthusiastically edible, if somewhat aggressively seasoned. The hands ate it without complaint. Cody had thirds. Jesse ate whatever was put in front of him, with the equanimity he brought to all things. Nora May sat at the table and ate and listened to the noise of the kitchen, the familiar sound of 20-some people occupying space together, and felt something she hadn't been able to feel in this kitchen since she'd arrived 6 months ago. She felt at home, not because anything in the room had changed. The table was the same. The fire was the same. The hands were the same. Loud, decent, hungry men they'd always been. But she was different. She was sitting at the table instead of moving around it. She was eating instead of serving. She was present instead of invisible. After dinner, after the hands had drifted off, and Clara had taken herself to bed, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had shepherded something difficult to a good end, Nora May found Jesse on the porch. He was standing at the railing looking out at the north pasture, where the last of the evening light was dying over the grass. She stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Boyd's going to leave town," Jesse said finally. "You think so? Man like that doesn't stay where he's been publicly beaten. He'll move on. Find somewhere new, start over." He paused. "That's the dangerous thing about men like Boyd. They find new places, new people who don't know yet." She'd thought about that too. "There's nothing I can do about that." "No," he agreed. "There isn't. You can only do what you could do, and you did it." She looked out at the pasture. The horses were dark shapes moving slowly in the last light. "Do you think it would have gone differently if I'd been—" She stopped finding the words. "If I'd been a different kind of woman, smaller, prettier by their standards, the kind of woman people feel sorry for easily." Jesse turned to look at her. "What do you mean? In that courtroom? The way Talbot said it, a woman her size. Like the way I'm built was a reason for what happened, or a reason not to believe it happened." She kept her eyes on the pasture. "I've been hearing that my whole life in different ways. Like the size of my body is a moral statement. Like I should expect less because I take up more space." Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Graves believed you. Graves believed the evidence." "No." Jesse turned back to face the pasture shoulder almost touching hers. "Graves believed you. There's a difference. Evidence is just paper and bone density and poker receipts. What made him rule the way he did was sitting in that room watching you tell the truth without flinching." He paused. "You did that. All of you. Not just your words." She thought about that. "Besides," Jesse said, "you've been in my kitchen for 6 months. I haven't once thought about the size of your body. I've thought about whether the ranch would fall apart if you quit, which is a completely different thing." Despite everything, despite the weight of the day and the strange open feeling of being freshly free, she laughed. It came out unexpected and real, and she didn't try to stop it. Jesse didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved in the way it did when he was pleased with something and didn't intend to make a show of it. They stood in comfortable quiet for another while. The stars were coming out over Wyoming, thick and unhurried. "I want to stay," she said. "I know. I want to stay and keep working. I want this to be where I am." She paused. "Not because I have nowhere else. I want you to understand that part. I'm not staying because you're the only option. I know that too. I'm staying because this is mine now. This kitchen, this ranch, this—" She gestured outward at the dark land and the stars and the cold air. "This is mine in a way that doesn't belong to anyone else. I built that. Even when everything else was terrible, I was building something here." Jesse nodded slowly. "Nora, I want to tell you something, and I want to say it plainly, so there's no question about what I mean." She waited. "I'm not going to push you toward anything," he said. "Not now, not in 6 months, not ever. Whatever you want your life to look like from here, if it's just the work and the room and your own name on your own terms, that is enough. That is more than enough, and you don't owe me anything beyond it." She looked at him. "But I want you to know," he continued, "that I'm not indifferent to you. I haven't been for a while." He said it the way he said all the hard things, quietly, directly, without decoration. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know where people actually stand, rather than having to guess. Not because I expect anything from it. Just so you know." The wind moved through the grass below the porch. A horse shifted in the pasture and was still. "I know," she said quietly. "I've known for a while. And—" She looked out at the land, at the stars, at the enormous sky that didn't rearrange itself for anyone's trouble, but simply kept being itself, which was its own kind of reliability. "And I need time," she said. "I need to be Nora Mae Calloway for a while before I'm anything else to anyone. I need to know what that feels like, just being myself. Taking up space without apologizing for it. Making choices because I want to make them, not because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't." "That's fair," Jesse said. "It might take a while." "I run 12,000 acres of Wyoming," he said. "I know how to be patient." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the pasture with the same expression he wore when he was watching weather, steady measured, already accounting for whatever came next. "Jesse." "Yeah." "Thank you," she said. "Not for the room or the lawyer or the courtroom. For that morning in the kitchen, when you could have walked away and said it wasn't your business, and you didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank yourself for that one too," he said. "I held the door open. You're the one who walked through it." She thought about that morning. The burning bacon, the counter, the pain, the sound of his voice from the doorway saying her name. The moment she'd turned around and let herself be seen. She'd thought then that being seen was the most dangerous thing. That visibility invited damage. She understood now that she'd had it exactly backward. Invisibility was what had kept her in that cabin for 6 months, flinching at doors and eating standing up and making herself smaller and smaller until there was barely anything left to hit. Being seen was what had saved her. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from Fry. Boyd Langley had left Casper. Last known direction was east toward Nebraska. Fry didn't expect any further legal action. Nora Mae read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and went back to the bread she was making. Clara was at the table drinking coffee, watching her. "That it?" Clara asked. "That's it." "How do you feel?" Nora Mae thought about it. She pushed her hands into the dough, feeling the give and resistance of it, the familiar weight and warmth. "Like I can breathe all the way down," she said finally. "Like there's no more waiting for the next thing." "Good." Clara drank her coffee. "That's what free feels like." Winter came in hard that year, the way Wyoming winters did, no warning, no negotiation, just cold arriving and settling in like it owned the place, which it did for 5 months out of 12. The ranch contracted inward, fewer hands, more work per person, long evenings with the fire high and the wind loud against the walls. Nora Mae cooked and managed and planned, and her word in the household became the final word on everything from meal schedules to supply orders to how the cold room was organized, and nobody questioned it, which was its own kind of extraordinary. She had opinions, and she expressed them, and people listened and adjusted. And none of that required her to be anything other than exactly who she was. She stopped flinching when doors slammed. She noticed the day it stopped a February afternoon, when the bunkhouse door banged hard in a gust, and she was standing at the stove and nothing in her body moved. She stood there for a moment, registering the absence of the old reflex, and then she went back to stirring. She told Clara that evening. Clara put down her mending and looked at her with the specific expression of someone who understood exactly what that meant. "Good," she said. Just that. But the way she said it carried everything. By March, Nora May had started keeping a ledger. Ranch account supply, costs, meal planning by week and by season, the calculations of what it took to feed 20-some men through a Wyoming winter and come out the other side with the pantry still stocked. She'd always done this in her head. Writing it down made her realize how much she'd been carrying without credit. She showed it to Jesse one evening. He looked through it slowly, page by page. She watched him read and said nothing. "You've been doing this math in your head this whole time," he said. "Yes." He looked up. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nobody asked. He looked at her for a moment, with the expression she'd come to recognize as him revising something. Then he said, "I'd like to pay you what this is actually worth. Starting next month. Jesse." "You've been managing my household accounts without the title or the wage," he said. "That stops now." She didn't argue. She'd been Nora May Calloway long enough by then to know the difference between accepting what she deserved and accepting more than she'd earned. Spring came slow, and then, all at once, the way spring did in Wyoming. The grass coming back green overnight, and the horses getting restless, and the whole ranch shaking off the long inward patience of winter. Nora May planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house. Clara helped on her days off. Jesse built the raised beds without being asked, appearing one Saturday morning with lumber and saying only that he'd had some extra wood. She planted tomatoes and beans and herbs and a row of sunflowers that had no practical purpose whatsoever, except that she had always wanted them and had never before lived somewhere she could decide to want something decorative and simply have it. In May, on a warm evening when the sunflowers were knee-high and pushing toward the light, Jesse came and stood beside her at the garden fence. "Nora," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said anything yet. I know what you are going to say." She looked at the sunflowers. "And I know what I'm going to say back." He waited. "Yes," she said simply. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, to which part?" "To building something," she said. "On our terms. Together." She turned to look at him, this man who moved quiet through his own life and meant what he said and said only what he meant. "I know who I am now. I know what I want and what I won't accept and what I'm worth. I know that I'm not choosing you because I need to be chosen." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing you because I want to. That's the only reason that's ever mattered." He reached over the fence and took her hand, not dramatically, not urgently, just held it the way he did everything, steady, unhurried, like a man who'd already decided and was simply arriving where he'd planned to be. They stood there in the May evening with the sunflowers reaching up between them and the Wyoming sky, enormous overhead. And Nora May Calloway felt the last thing she'd expected to feel at the end of this particular road. She felt like herself. Completely, solidly, irrevocably herself, not the frightened woman who'd held herself up against a stove at 5 in the morning. Not Boyd Langley's wife, not the big plain cook who ought to be grateful for what she had. Just herself. Taking up exactly as much space as she was meant to take up. Standing on land that held her weight without apology. Loved by a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning and had never once suggested she be smaller than she was. She had walked through the hardest year of her life and come out on the other side, not diminished, but expanded bigger in all the ways that actually mattered. And not 1 inch of what she had now had been given to her. Every bit of it she had chosen. That was the thing Boyd Langley had never understood, and could never have taken from her, even in the worst of it, that a woman who knows her own worth is not a woman who can be permanently diminished. You could crack her ribs. You could tell her she was nothing. You could make her invisible to herself for a season. But you could not make it permanent, not if she was paying any attention at all. Nora Mae Calloway had been paying attention, and now standing in the evening light with her hand in Jessie Whitmore's, and her sunflowers growing tall, and her name finally fully her own, she was done surviving. She had started at last to live.